Hello, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics' 2021 spring semester, The Modern American City, Past, Present, and Future. I am Patrick Tuohey with the Better Cities Project, a fellow of the Dole Institute. This is our last of our seven sessions, and I think I'm finally getting the hang of it. I'm grateful to Senators Dole, the University of Kansas, and of course the Dole Institute and everyone there for making this series possible. This semester, we've discussed issues relating to poverty, including affordable housing, historic segregation, municipal finance, and the way in which well-intended government regulation often stands in the way of entrepreneurship. So I'm grateful to tackle the issue of poverty directly this week. Over the past few years, we've all seen stories of homeless camps in some of our major American cities, even while unemployment was at historically low levels. And of course, the government swung into action during the COVID-19 pandemic due to very reasonable fears that it would greatly increase poverty. I realize that this issue is much greater than anything we could hope to cover in a single hour, but today I'm hoping to learn how we define poverty in the United States, the history of anti-poverty programs, and some successful ways in addressing it with my guests, Angela Rachidi and Jesús Gerena, both of whom have dedicated their careers to the issue. Angela Rachidi is the Rowe Scholar in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where her research focuses on the relationship between employment and poverty, specifically the effectiveness of government programs and policies on increasing employment and family well-being. Jesús Gerena is the CEO of the Family Independence Initiative, a charitable organization that trusts and invests in low-income families, allowing them to move themselves out of poverty. If you have questions during this session, I encourage you to email them to dolequestions@ku.edu, and we will endeavor to get to them at the end of the session. Poverty seems intractable, and maybe part of the challenge is how we define it. Certainly, talk of the bottom quartile is unacceptable because it's relative. Even among billionaires, there is a bottom quartile. And I'm always suspect of looking at mere income data because it seems to ignore that the same dollar buys a lot more in 2021 than it did in 1980. And then there is the issue of permanence. Are the millions of people living in poverty the same year to year, or does the data reflect people in temporary situations? So, Angela, those are kind of the beginning of my questions for you. Thank you for being with us. Feel free to correct any of the statements I've made, but I'd like to start by simply defining the terms. How do we define poverty? And has that definition changed over time?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Patrick, for having me in the Dole Institute. It's great to be with you. And you would think that that is a very straightforward question with a straightforward answer, but it's not, of course. We actually have multiple ways to define poverty in the US. And oftentimes our poverty measures conflict with each other, meaning that they tell kind of different stories. So I want to focus on kind of two of them that I think tell the most relevant story of how our country has dealt with poverty and the trends in poverty over time. So the official poverty measure, which is produced by the US Census Bureau and goes back to the 1960s, is largely based on income, as you mentioned. And it is adjusted for inflation. So for the most part, the poverty rate is the same or has the same power as it had in 1980 as now. But the problem we have with the official poverty rate is it only includes income that people report on surveys, and it excludes a great number of the government benefits that are provided to families. So it's become somewhat irrelevant in assessing kind of poverty in this country and how our government programs have addressed poverty. So the measure we more rely on now, meaning poverty scholars and kind of academics in the policy world, is what we call a supplemental poverty measure, which does factor in government benefits and also kind of adjusts the threshold based on inflation, to your earlier point. And what we see when we look at that measure is actually a fairly large reduction in poverty in this country over the last really 20, 30 years since the late 1990s, and a large reduction in poverty among children in particular. And much of that is attributed to an expansion in government benefits, mostly around refundable tax credits and nutrition assistance. And I think your last point about does our poverty metric reflect the same families each year, or families coming in and out of poverty, is really a good one, because a couple years ago I actually did a study looking at the persistence of poverty and how do families, the dynamics of families going in and out of poverty each year. And it really highlighted one bright spot in this country, which is that long-term poverty is actually relatively rare in this country. It was about 6% of those in poverty in any given year would spend even 4 out of the next 5 years in poverty. So what we see in our poverty metrics each year tend to be different families, but that also shows that we have a lot of income volatility in this country.
So how big is that population then? Maybe it's just in numbers of people at any given time who are considered impoverished, or a percentage of the population. And then I was listening to a podcast this morning about homelessness, and that's what got me thinking about it. What are the populations that we include in impoverished? So, for example, we clearly would have the homeless, the working poor, people who are food insecure, or maybe people who are rent cost burdened. So, kind of, can we describe all the different aspects of poverty that we mean when we talk about poverty?
Yeah, so another good question. And you, again, you'd hope it would have a straightforward answer. Roughly about 13% of individuals in the US are in poverty. And I say roughly because, again, it does depend on the metric that you're using to define what that percentage is. But if you use the official measure and even the supplemental measure, it's about 13% of people in poverty. And among children, it's around 17%. Of children. And like I said, those rates have come down quite dramatically, and were the lowest historically on record in 2019, right before the pandemic. And who goes into those numbers is also a good question. So it's people who respond to a census survey. So people who are institutionalized, so people who are in prison, for example, are not counted in those numbers. Even other group quarters like homeless shelters may not be counted in that number. So it is important to pay attention to who is in those numbers and who is not, as well as the levels of those metrics.
So you talk about the supplemental number instead of straight income. So I'm familiar with just watching news stories, and again, this is not my field of expertise, that we talk about the poverty line, the number of people below the poverty line. Is that straight income, or is that services, supplemental, what you described before?
It usually is just straight income. And the reason I say usually because one of the problems with having multiple metrics is that media sources, even policymakers, can kind of pick and choose metrics that they feel fits their narrative. But what we generally hear when we hear people talking about how high poverty is, it's the official poverty measure because it's only based on income. And when you hear people talk about the effectiveness of our government programs, you'll hear people talk about the supplemental poverty measure because that captures all of those benefits.
Do you have a sense of how our poverty rates compare with other Western countries? I think you said 13% of the population and 17% of children. How are we doing compared to our neighbors, compared to Europe?
Yeah, we actually do well when you use a metric that uses an absolute threshold, meaning that it's not relative to the income distribution in the country. And so when you use an absolute threshold that tries to reflect the same cost of living across countries, the US does fairly well when you compare us to places like the UK, Ireland, Denmark. This is the National Academy of Sciences just did this comparison a couple of years ago because it's not an easy thing to do because poverty measurement is problematic across countries, but we actually do fairly well. Where we don't do well, and what you'll often hear in the media, is how we have the highest child poverty rates in the developed world. Where we don't do well is on relative measures. And that's because relative measures, like I said, are based on income distribution, and the US has very high income inequality. So those metrics really more reflect income inequality than they do kind of a material well-being or an absolute poverty line.
So just to make sure I understand that correctly, because the United States is a wealthy country, our lowest group may be higher than the average or some of the higher groups in other countries, yet that is counted against us in relative measures.
It is a little bit, because those relative measures are based on usually about 50% of median income, for example. And because our income distribution in the US, because we have a lot of wealthy people and we have low income people, it's just much more dispersed. And so that median is much higher in the US than it is in other countries because we have more wealthy people. So the standard that we're using across countries is unequal. And so it's, in my view, not apples to apples and not really fair to hold us to that standard.
And then I know this is a big question, but I'm hoping for a reasonably short answer. Can you give us kind of an overview of at least the federal government's efforts to fight poverty in the United States? Did it begin with LBJ's war on poverty? And what has it looked like over time?
Certainly, and even predates the war on poverty, but certainly the major programs were created around the war on poverty. But really the most transformational time in the US in terms of fighting poverty happened in the late 1990s with welfare reform, where our system for cash assistance for poor families was completely transformed and much more strongly connected to work. That coupled with the expansion of the earned income tax credit, which is a refundable tax credit that goes to low-income working families and has become the largest in terms of assistance or cash basis, has become the largest program for low-income families in the country.
And so the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, has generally been successful?
It has been successful in a couple ways, actually. It has led to increased employment, especially among single mother families who are disproportionately poor and also disproportionately non-working. And so when that credit was expanded in the late 1990s, we saw, coupled with welfare reform, we saw a very large increase in employment rates, especially among never married single mothers. And that has been expanded a few times over the years. So it's increased employment. And it has also then reduced, or I should say, pulled out a number of children from poverty. And we have quite a bit of data to show that that was true.
So Jesus, I want to bring you into this conversation. You've spent years working on the front lines of anti-poverty programs. And I'm curious to know how your experience maybe delivering services or perhaps working more closely with families differs from government programs, tax credits, cash layouts.
Yeah, and first, thank you, Patrick, for having me, and it's great to be with you and Dr. Rachidi in this conversation. I think a couple of things, as you were mentioning before, about what is poverty, right? And I love the addition and understanding that it's not a constant position, right? That even for those on the economic ladder who are defined as being struggling in poverty, for us it's important to add a couple of additional elements. One is that because you're poor doesn't mean that you're poor in other aspects in your life, right? You could be have a whole bunch of additional resources inside of your community, in your networks, in your connections that could support you and are likely supporting you to be able to do better. And it's one of the reasons why people continue to be able to create that and support some mobility in their lives. I think that the other piece that is important for us to really recognize is that the system continuously punishes people for doing better in that mobility. And as such, they can never create enough assets and savings and wealth to be able to overcome whatever life challenges they get, whether it is health emergencies, a car breaking down, a loss of a job or hours, a child getting sick, so that when those emergencies happen, that they don't fall back into the below that poverty line. And those are the cycles that we continuously are seeing, that people are struggling to be able to sustain their mobility, not so much to gain that mobility. And that as a country, we are either punishing or looking about what folks in that side of the income ladder are missing, rather than what they have. And so for us, really is to help others be able to recognize the strengths that exist inside of these under-resourced and undervalued communities, and shift our mentality in both lifting about what is good, but also investing in it.
You know, I'm in Kansas City, Missouri, and years ago when the state and the courts investigated what had happened in Ferguson with, small town governments using fees to basically prey on their own populations, we learned about the stories that I'm sure you both are familiar with, which is, somebody is working basically hand to mouth, but maybe they get a speeding ticket. They're ordered to appear to court. They don't go to court because they figure rationally their time is better spent at work because they don't have the money to pay the fee. And so then a bench warrant is issued, and it just starts this cycle that no one intended, but yet kind of keeps its boot on the throat of people who are trying to do the right thing, who are trying to live lives, pay their taxes, contribute to society. Jesus, what you said about poverty programs kind of working against people, what are the examples? I'm aware, for example, maybe Social Security benefits will count against married couples, but what are the examples of, again, well-intended programs that unintentionally have negative effects?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I think if we think about the safety net and a lot of the reforms that happened in the 90s around welfare programs, first, that we have vilified those who are struggling in poverty, and what led to a lot of those policy changes, right? So we had built at that point a narrative that if you were poor, it was because you chose to be, right? Because there were plenty of opportunities around that you were not taking advantage of, that you were trying to game a system, that you were lazy, a moocher, right? And in addition to that, actually, a lot of racist stereotypes that were put in, right? And the most famous of which is, the welfare queen of the 80s. And that's why we needed to be able to reform those programs. And so what happens in those policy reforms is, whether it's food stamps or any sort of supplemental income that you are receiving to maintain a threshold of dignity in your life and being able to afford housing, as well as give care to your children, as well as be able to feed them. As you start climbing up that economic ladder, you're being disincentivized to do so because they take away those resources from you. And on the other end of that, in the tax sort of benefits, or whether it's the earned income tax credit or any other investment, really, all of those are also going down until you get to the $70,000 to $80,000 income line, where all of a sudden that there's new investments happening to you at your terms. But between that $30,000 to $70,000, $80,000 line, once you sort of lose those sorts of supports, there's nothing new to be able to incentivize you to build those assets as you do better. And that's really unfortunate for many reasons. And I'll use my own personal experience in this. And it goes in line with a lot of these reforms. My mom was a welfare recipient, was doing her undergrad, graduated, and got a full scholarship to be able to get a master's. And I was a teenager at that time, and I have two older siblings. And she wasn't allowed to do that. She wasn't allowed to be able to continue her education, to be able to get a better paying job that in the last 30 years more than paid for that small investment at that time for her to be able to continue to advance her career. And essentially it was a social worker looking the other way that gave her the opportunity to be able to do so. It's unfortunate that our system at all times takes people having to bypass or take shortcuts to be able to overcome its inefficiencies and really reward the hard work that is happening inside of those income levels.
So just broadly, would a program of kind of graduated benefits address this? So for example, it encourages you to earn more, even if your government benefit goes down. Your take home at the end of the day is still higher. The government outlay is lower, but that seems like a no-brainer, but that's not what we do now.
No, and it's funny, right? Because going about 4 years ago now, we had this huge, massive tax cut for the wealthy in this country and corporations, right? Like totaling almost $2 trillion. And that was like, right, from a narrative perspective, it was like, this is going to be rewarding. This is going to be able to create all sorts of ripples inside of our economy. And what we do know now is that's just simply is not true. It creates ripples inside of those individual households and their communities, but it doesn't travel outside. But there's a lesson to be learned there in that sort of investment does have an impact in people's wealth. And what we ask all the time is, and to your question, why aren't we creating similar vehicles of investments to other aspects of our, areas of our income ladder for them to be able to create equally as much wealth as other parts of our income ladder?
So I've got another question for you, Jesus. We heard Angela talk about how the government defines poverty or how it struggles to define poverty. When a family approaches you, what are the things that you look at? Is it strictly income? Is it income plus services? How do you define poverty? How does your organization decide who's I guess I don't want to say worthy, but who you bring into the program and who you don't?
Yeah, great question. So a couple of things. For us, we have some general parameters that we are overlaying for our ability to continue to demonstrate the evidence of the impact of our work, which, we're not a program or a service. What we're saying is there's already huge value inside of under-resourced and undervalued communities. Let us help you see it. And we will invest in it so that we can rise that evidence and so others can see it and hopefully adopt our model. And so the parameters are meant to be pretty wide so that those individuals can help us understand who they are, what are their current economic position, as well as what are their goals and what they're trying to achieve. And I think specifically, we do 50 to 150% of area median income to be able to invest in those individuals. And we see that enough as a place where if you're laying between those 2 points, you're struggling economically in one way or the other, not only because of the inability to quickly continue to build assets that support you long-term, but because we also know that the system itself is not going to recognize you and match your efforts to be able to build those assets and those savings and support you in the long term. And so that gives us enough of a bearing. And then what we ask is individuals to identify who their household is, to actually surface all of their income, whether it's formal or informal, so that we get a pretty accurate picture inside and what people are trying to do. And almost always, it really hits on the mark, actually. It hits like about 90% of our households fall within those 2 lines, even though we're outlining it for ourselves and letting people define it and match the 2 together.
So Angela, you heard that description and the frustration with how benefits are handed out now. They're not graduated, people are penalized. That certainly isn't news to you. Are there programs that try to take that into consideration? And are there programs that do a better job than maybe others?
Sure. So just a point of clarification, all of our federal safety net programs do gradually phase out as income increases. So some of the problems happen though is because these programs operate independently. So they're not necessarily, those phase outs are not necessarily coordinated, but they do phase out. Housing assistance is probably the one area that is a little bit more complicated, but the other programs do phase out as income increases. But that doesn't, we still have a lot of complications in how these benefit programs are administered. And there certainly is a lot of decision making. And when people take on new jobs or take on additional hours, they can face the potential loss of benefits because their income might put them over an income eligibility level. So it's definitely a problem. The solution to that problem is to phase these benefits out even slower. The problem with that is it costs a lot of money and would expand benefits much further up the income scale. So it's a well-known problem that policymakers have been kind of wrestling with for years. It's just there's never been a very good solution.
So Angela, after listening to Jesus talk about how the organization works with individuals and communities and gets them to, compile their real income, including, off the book stuff, is there any sense that, private organizations, charitable organizations do a better job of identifying and helping, people living with poverty than government programs? And I guess I know it's a combination of the two, but I'm wondering what is to be learned from private organizations that maybe spend much more time on the ground in communities, and say federal programs that from far away mean well, but maybe don't get such good results.
Yes, I think our community-based programs and neighborhood level programs do a much better job addressing issues within families, within households. Addressing issues, coming up with solutions for those issues. They're just much closer to the families and much closer to the situation. And the federal government programs are not good at that at all. And one of the reasons is the federal programs are administered based on federal legislation, which often by necessity has to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And if it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, it becomes very complicated and becomes very difficult to administer at the local level. So I think the right balance is to empower local organizations, community-based organizations, to empower them to serve their populations, and empower them in the sense that they should be well-resourced, but not completely resourced by the government. They should have some skin in the game as well, but empowered in the sense that they have flexibility to serve families with those federal resources in the way that they feel will best meet the needs of those families.
So Jesus, in your experience, how good is the federal government at working with organizations that are on the ground, such as yours? Maybe they can't be flexible, but how often are they good partners, and how often are they just sources of frustration? Perhaps is the way I want to ask it.
Yeah, that's a great question. What you can imagine right now is most of the time I'm feeling frustrated, or have historically felt frustrated, in that we're constantly, if we can help them understand about the value inside of these communities and shifting their attitude and their practice to better invest in them, my job would be a lot easier. What I would say is that even prior to 2020, prior to the pandemic, I believe a lot of social service state social service departments, as well as federal, were feeling frustrated about, as we were talking before, the high levels of child poverty and those indicators not changing over the last few decades. And so how to be able to act differently given those challenges, and understanding that there was a lot of money being invested inside of these communities through programs and services, but not to individuals. And so given our work and being able to recognize the ability of individuals and their communities and investing in them, a huge interest in changing so that they could better support them as a result. And I would say, that's an important point, that we are investing constantly in programs and services to affect the issue of poverty. We are not investing in people who are facing that poverty to be able to do better for themselves. And there is oftentimes, as a result, right, whether intentional or not, and I would argue is intentional, a mistrust about these communities' own abilities, given that narrative that I spoke about that has been built over the decades. And an easy way to really illustrate this is the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which was created specifically so that as those individuals who were being supported through public housing and rent subsidies as they were gaining dollars through their income, instead of increasing their rent, right, and taking the amount of subsidies that they were receiving, that they would match whatever the increase of income was as it related to their rent inside of a savings account, so that they could grow a cushion that could eventually help them and propel them out of that subsidy as a whole. And I believe it was something like 98% of those dollars were not being used. And the reason was that it was too burdensome for individuals to meet with social workers, figure out whatever the program guidelines were for folks to be able to be approved, to be able to participate in those sorts of, to gain that benefit of the financial self-sufficiency. And so, again, we are making it so hard and lack trust, as well as a result investment inside of people's already inherent abilities. Why do we make it so burdensome for them to have to go through these hoops, rather than just say, hey, we see and recognize what you're doing, let us reward it, let us invest it. And I think that sort of mindset and attitude, it's taken for granted in other parts of our society. And we are all often struggling to get others to recognize being poor doesn't mean that you lack character, ability, initiative, or will, right? Like it just means that you're struggling financially. And oftentimes there have been many reasons outside of your own control that has happened. Why not begin to undo and change that dynamic? First, the federal government can act differently pretty easily to be able to do so.
Well, you bring me to one of the questions I had, and it was an education for me. I realize both of you working in this space, this may be common knowledge, but I live in Kansas City, and recently the city voted on creating a program to provide universal pre-K. In my research on the topic, I learned that there was some indication, research from the Brookings Institution said that the best way to increase education outcomes was in fact not pre-K, but was actually the earned income tax credit. And when I articulated that to people who supported pre-K, they said, well, the earned income tax credit isn't earmarked, right? People may take that money and may not spend it on pre-K. Yet the earned income tax credit had better results. And maybe it's because, Jesus, to your point, it trusted in the agency of individuals to solve their own problems, rather than, in the case of Kansas City, instituting a sales tax and then giving them a service. You know, the sales tax is the most regressive of taxes. And so, Angela, starting with you, is the EITC a rarity in that, in its success, and in that it is, kind of a direct cash benefit rather than a service?
Well, I think it's not so much a rarity, like in an international context. I think almost all, like European countries at least, have some sort of a cash payment to families, like the earned income tax credit. So not necessarily a rarity. There's certain features of it that are a little bit unique in the U.S. context, but not such a rarity. But it is very true. I mean, your point's exactly right, that there's this kind of assumption that universal pre-K is going to be beneficial to every child that goes through it, when in fact we have quite a bit of research to suggest that not all universal pre-K programs are implemented very well and are pretty low quality, and in some cases can even harm children. So I think we have to get past those assumptions sometimes, and the best way to get past those assumptions that government has the answer and government can run these programs in an effective way is to give people assistance and let them use it in the way they see fit. I will, though, caution that has some negative consequences if you are doing harm in other ways. For example, if you're providing cash payments to people who are not working, you could disincentivize them from working, which would have other long-term consequences for them. So all to say, kind of a very complicated picture with a lot of moving pieces.
Let me follow up on that. Is there an understanding in the policy world that the federal government doesn't work well with local organizations? Is there an effort to, I shouldn't ask, is there an effort? How can the federal government better work with local organizations to provide them the resources they need so that they can see even more success in working closely with the families that need assistance?
I think the biggest challenge, or what makes it so difficult, is that the federal government, when they're resourcing either states or local communities, they're using federal tax dollars. So these are taxpayers who are contributing their income. And so there's a responsibility to hold states and communities accountable for that money. And that really reduces a lot of flexibility that these communities can have. And that's why you have to have so much oversight. And I understand the need for the oversight. And that's why I think sometimes you can't always assume that the federal government is the answer. So I think there is a recognition that local communities are better equipped to serve the needs of families. And I think that's a role for philanthropy and for charities, and maybe the federal government shouldn't be in the business of doing some of those things.
So Jesus, to that point, from what I've learned about your organization, you exactly bank on the agency of the people that you're working with. You identify people who are willing to help themselves, to work with others in their community. Maybe this question answers itself, but would you like to see more direct cash assistance? Because you're also aware of the opportunities to make things worse, as Angela said, or to encourage fraud. What is a good way to get people the assistance they need to trust their agency, but without making taxpayers into suckers?
Yeah, great question. So I think first is, going back to our own, for the last 20 years, what we've been able to learn from direct investment is that overwhelmingly people always are making the right choices because they identify that choice, right, as how to invest those dollars inside of their households. And in addition to our findings, as the guaranteed income pilot here in Stockton just revealed their findings at SEED, or the international organization Give Directly has been able to prove through their own evaluations. Overwhelmingly, and for us again, actually last year, we were able to, in results to the pandemic, disperse about close to $130 million and survey and learn about the transactions that people use, for one-time $500 payments in the middle of the pandemic. Overwhelmingly, it's always around basic needs or paying electrical bills or other debt to be able to keep them from spiraling into a crisis or emergency. And so that as a data point, right, is really critical that, and you add to that only about 6% of those people, as Angela noted, are stuck in permanent poverty, right? That most folks, 94% of the folks are working hard to find a way to do better. And so the signaling, to your point, Patrick, of saying, hey, we know that, and we need to do a better job of recognizing and investing in it, it's only going to catalyze that movement further. And again, we see that in other areas of our economy, as far as like the higher income levels. And I can share my own sort of experience as I went up the income ladder. What happened as a result? I'm always thinking about being able to strengthen that position, not to be frivolous and sort of spend in a way that will put me in inability to sustain that over time, and not only that, but care for my children. And I think that mentality is really important to understand and to recognize. And when you take that approach and recognize people's own abilities and also their desire to be able to do better, then yes, I think institutions can be an additional stopgap if that is what you hear from those communities to be able to sustain. But your point around Kansas City and the earned income tax credit, when it comes back to children's outcomes, it's a parent knows best. Put the resources in their hands. And for me, that could be that I want some sort of institutional childcare. And for you, that could be some personalized childcare. Or maybe you have a family member that can actually support you. And we should be investing in both because we want to show that sort of love and compassion to our children across the country.
Yeah, Kansas City is certainly not a conservative city politically. And I was just surprised at the number of people who would describe themselves as being left of center and who were interested in the well-being of the poor, but who apparently did not trust those people they were trying to help to make decisions for themselves. It was really very shocking, especially when we knew that a program that did trust them to take care of themselves was showing better results. So behind me somewhere is a book by P.J. O'Rourke, who is a libertarian humorist. In one of his books, he pointed out that if the federal government simply wrote a check to everyone below the poverty line to bring them up to it, we'd eradicate poverty and save taxpayers a great deal of money. Now, O'Rourke is a humorist and he's not a policy researcher, but Angela, is it possible to know how much money we spend in overhead? And there's a lot of talk lately about a universal basic income. I mean, is there something to the idea that if we can identify the people in need, we better serve them by trusting their agency, cutting them a check, and maybe saving taxpayers a bunch of money?
I mean, sure, that always sounds nice, but there is a thing called moral hazard. So if you write everybody a check, if you write every poor person a check, then everyone will want to be poor so they can get that check. And so that's why we don't take the nearly $1 trillion we spend on anti-poverty programs and just write checks. And so that's really the difficult aspects that policymakers face. And I will say the EITC is connected to work. It only goes to working families. So it's not, there's still some restrictions on it. It's not a guaranteed income. It's not structured like that. And to Jesus's point, I agree. I mean, I worked for the New York City Department of Social Services for a number of years, and the vast majority of families I encountered there also had the very best intentions, most wanted to work, wanted to do what was right for their families. But there's always that small portion who that's not their motivation. And I'm sure a lot of the unmotivated families are not the ones that are showing up in these types of programs. But the policymakers at the federal level have to also be concerned about that share of the population. And if you ignore that share of the population, it reduces the integrity of the program. It loses public confidence. And if you lose public confidence and integrity, you're not going to have much of a program longer. So like I said, not easy. There's not a lot of easy solutions, but it's important to kind of balance all of these different perspectives and recognize that what sometimes seems like a simple solution never really is.
No, I certainly appreciate that. If something seems simple, that's a red flag itself. You mentioned your work in New York. How good is the federal government at working with municipalities? Again, I know you said earlier that the federal government often has a one-size-fits-all, but at least in the way maybe they fund municipal programs, block grants, and things like that, do they do a good job? And are there cities that show better outcome with federal money than others?
Sure. I mean, I'd have to say in my years, I spent about 10 years working for New York City. And then our oversight agency was actually the state, and then the federal government was their oversight agency. It's not easy to work in these federal programs. There's always conflict because the federal government is always trying to hold the states and the cities accountable, and the cities and the states are always trying to do things, and the federal government's telling them that you can't do that. So it's a constant struggle. And I think that's somewhat just the nature, because you do have to have these checks and balances. And when the federal government is allocating funding from, again, federal taxes, there is a responsibility for accountability at the state and local level. And I think the same goes in the other direction, that the cities and the states who are trying to run these programs know their populations better than the federal government. And the federal government probably should listen to the cities and the states more. But it's certainly, at least in my experience, was never an easy relationship, always very challenging. And there's certainly, to your last point, there's certainly cities and states who figure it out. I mean, New York actually does a pretty good job working with the federal government, but that doesn't mean that it's easy.
So Jesus, let me ask you a similar question. The Family Independence Initiative works around New England. I am sure there are, and I'm not asking you to name them, but I'm sure there are municipalities that have been great to work with. I'm sure there are municipalities that have been difficult. What are the things that cities and states can do to ease your job, basically to help you help them?
Yeah, and just quick clarification. So we are across the country. I'm based in California. We're launching here in Oakland a guaranteed income pilot. And it's been really refreshing sort of to use this one as an example. And then I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in Boston, Massachusetts as well. But the mayor understood from the very beginning that a guaranteed income pilot was just going to be able to do just that, right? It was always going to just bring up enough evidence as to the value of direct investment so that either the state or the federal government could take it to scale. And actually has been focusing on targeting BIPOC communities, and given the historical challenges that have been, and the racist challenges that have been imposed to them, but also families itself, because she saw the earned income tax credit as a potential avenue for growth. And in California, actually, the tax credit has already been increased through the state itself. And so we see that as a really big policy opportunity that, if it's proven out here, could be taken to scale from a state level to then potentially a federal level in that way. And that's a great example for how we love to work with municipalities, is really thinking about not necessarily doing the blanket, write everybody a check, but there are ways and existing potential policies that we can increase the investment in people or create new ones, right? That is matching the criteria of folks that we want to really be able to continue to support and grow. And the other example that I would use is the city of Boston a couple of years ago really loved our work and what we were trying to do and wanted to help us take it to scale. And what they recognized is that the way that they were working in their budget process didn't allow them to be able to increase to sort of do this sort of pilots or demonstrations. And so they brought in the Department of Transitional Assistance and specifically thought that if we could work with that statewide agency in being able to demonstrate the advantages of our strength-based approach, that they could change their policies and as such better support the constituencies in the city of Boston. And so we are just launched a pilot randomized control trial in partnership with the Harvard Business School, who's doing the research component of it, with the Department of Transitional Assistance to demonstrate what is the benefit of having the unrestricted cash investment versus the more traditional tiered, already working policies that the department has. And simultaneously, the Department of Transitional Assistance has already increased asset limits, which we know are capping people's ability to support their own mobility, as well as forces them to hide assets, right? So that they're not punished as a result of building themselves up. And those are, to me, just great examples of the way that we can really partner with these municipalities, as well as to raise powerful potential policy impacts, not only for the state, but for the country.
So to Angela's point, the program that you're talking about, it's a direct cash benefit, but it's not a universal basic income, right? Is this going to people that are already working? Angela says if you subsidize not working, you'll get more of it, basically. And I think that's exactly right. And I suspect you agree as well. So how are you structuring it? Who's eligible?
No, that's exactly right. So and going back to more traditional boundaries that I spoke to, the 50 to 150, that continues to be our target. But what we also say is it's not meant to be exclusive. We want to learn. We want to learn from the individuals and what position they're at and why they may be inside or outside or below that income guideline that we're following. Not to assume that we have the answers, but to really seek out the answers. And I think that's a really critical difference in our work and our approach, which is that we know that there's ways that communities are working with one another and supporting one another as well as individuals. And what we need to do is to stop thinking that we can bring an answer to them, but to lift those answers and help others pay attention and invest in them as well.
I want to spend the last few minutes talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's affected poverty and poverty rates in the United States. And Angela, let me just kind of ask the broadest possible question. What's the impact been? And the federal government spent an awful lot of money trying to avoid its worst fears of increased poverty. Did that work? And is there something we've learned from it?
Great question. It did work if you're looking at our poverty metrics. So certainly when the pandemic hit, me along with most people, like you said, expected poverty to increase, mostly because the level of employment disruptions was just unprecedented. And it really hit low-income households especially hard. But as you mentioned, the federal investment has also been unprecedented. So much more than even the Great Recession. And so what we saw in poverty and our poverty rates, there were some actually researchers, some affiliated with AEI, and there were some affiliated with Columbia University, were able to quickly kind of transform our annual poverty measures into something that we could see in real time. And what both groups found independently is that the poverty rate actually declined in April, May, and June, right after the pandemic, largely due to the economic impact payments, increases in SNAP, and unemployment insurance. Then we saw a slight uptick as those programs started to expire and phase out. But now, given the passage of the December package, we saw poverty rates start to decline again, leading up to the American Rescue Plan, which was the March bill. So we expect to see poverty rates to continue to decline. So kind of an alternative expectation to what I think many of us thought would happen, but as you said, really due to the very large federal investment to address the pandemic.
So what can we learn from that? I mean, the cash benefits seem to go out to individual families regardless of earnings, at least the first payment, if I remember correctly. And it didn't necessarily, it couldn't have encouraged work. It was just a check. And then, of course, there was the forgivable loans that went out to businesses if they maintained their payroll. I can easily imagine people learning the lesson like, hey, if we just write checks, it works. Do we have enough data to know if that's the case? And if we don't have that data yet, what are some things we should look for in the next few months or years that will give us a hint as to what's going on?
Yeah, you're exactly right. What we did learn is that if you give people money, they will be less poor. But that is obviously not a long-term policy strategy. There was no way to finance these large packages, and the bill will come due eventually. And to your point, we don't necessarily, all of these were temporary in nature. Even the American Rescue Plan, which was the March bill, largely temporary in nature. Some of these large expansions to the child tax credit, for example, is time limited to 1 year. There's talks of making it permanent, but it's time limited to 1 year. So I think temporary measures like this make sense, especially during a pandemic when employment disruptions were so high. But we won't know the longer term effects of some of these programs, especially if they do become permanent. And that's where I start to have some concern. If we have this very large expansion to the safety net, very generous benefits that are not connected to work, is that going to decrease employment in the long run and actually make people worse off? I think those are questions that are unanswered, and it'll be quite a while before we're able to answer those questions.
Jesus, similarly, how has the pandemic affected the ability of organizations like yours to meet people's needs? You said earlier, and I can imagine that the psychological impact of losing a job, like so many people did, is itself, a hindrance. But to what degree did federal intervention work, and what do you think we can learn from it?
Yeah, a couple of things. First is, for us, we've been advocating, right, for a couple of decades about the value of direct investment. And, going to your earlier comment in regards to, for us, we're a nonpartisan organization, but whether it's the left or the right, everybody opposed that there, whether it was because we didn't want to invest in those who were struggling in poverty, or because that's not the way that we help those who are struggling in poverty. Overwhelmingly, right? Like we were trying to help people understand the value, the abilities, again, right, of those who fall inside of those income levels. And what the pandemic did, it actually sort of lifted that cloud of pessimism and inability to believe in people's ability to say, actually, these are folks, especially from philanthropy, as the federal government didn't act, to say, well, we need to do something. We should invest in them directly. And I think that what happened, even though it was only small relief through the first care package, and now with the relief package, is that it eases the burden on us, right? Because we reached fundraising levels we never saw before because of our unique capability of quickly, through our online platform, Up Together, dispersing cash. And so people, both municipalities, states, as well as philanthropy, came to us and said, because there is a lack of action on the federal level in 2020, let us put dollars through your platform to be able to meet that need. And I think that the Relief Act has eased some of that burden. But what I would also add is, and going to Angela's point on whether or not it's sustainable is, again, going back to that tax relief that we gave the wealthy in 2017, nobody asked whether or not that was sustainable. It was seen as an investment that was going to pay itself back. And I would argue the same today, that we are making new investments in people. And again, there's ways to be able to think about policies in a way that better supports already the actions that are happening. And it's really important from our point of view to continue to highlight there is a ton of really good work happening inside of these under-resourced and undervalued communities in spite of a system that doesn't see it or recognize it. All we're asking for is to celebrate it and invest in it. And it's such a simple shift, and one that will have a critical impact inside of that income inequality that we continue to see rise across our country.
So, Jesus, let me follow up on that a little bit. So how do you know, or an organization like yours know, when you have successfully intervened and it's time to stop, right? The person has reached a particular level. You talked about kind of the $30,000 to $70,000 maybe when somebody gets above that. But I can imagine, just like you said earlier, with people hiding assets, it can be very tempting. I certainly would be tempted to, if there was, government support coming my way, to not demonstrate that I had risen above it. And it seems like organizations like yours spend an awful lot of time making sure that you get somebody to a point, but then you move them on so that you can work, you can use those same dollars to find somebody at the bottom. Maybe that's not something that government would do very well, but your organizations would have to do that very well. And how do you do it?
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding correctly your question, what I would say is that, again, that there's a ton of really good that is happening inside of these communities. And the question is, the important recognition is that there's a system built not to see that. The safety net, as an example, is constantly asking what's wrong with you, what are you missing, what is sort of your biggest need at the moment. It doesn't ask What are you doing to improve your position? Who is helping you? Who is your community to be able to support you? How can we, like if you had added resources, could you be able to advance towards whatever personal goals that, or community goals that you have? And that shift would then give confidence to people and bring a dignity and a respect of recognizing all of those things are true. Like people are doing these things for themselves. Again, we're not asking or being able to see it. And so what we see in our evidence and what we've been able to show over the last 2 decades is that it may not be the way that you envision that they're going to spend the dollars, right? It could be that they pay down some debt first, but they're paying down that debt because they want to increase their credit score so that they can buy a house, right? And so although they won't use those dollars to necessarily put that savings to get to that house, they're taking the right step to get to that place. Or they'll lose income because they go back to school and they're positioning themselves to then make better money as a result of getting a better job for investment in that education, or they're investing in their children. There is just all sorts of ways and freedoms that when you are taking the stress of thinking hand to mouth, which is if that's all you can do, that's what all you're thinking about, and give them the position and the investment to put that creativity back in their hands. What we know is that people continue to do, and you don't have to be afraid. It may not always be your answer, but they're developing answers for themselves. People are, for the majority, and there'll always be bad actors and bad players, but for the majority, people are looking to be able to improve their economic position.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. Let me thank both of today's guests, Angela Rachidi of the American Enterprise Institute and Jesús Gerena of the Family Independence Initiative. And I'm grateful to all of you who have spent these few hours with us this semester for your concern for our cities and for your thoughtful questions. On behalf of everyone at the Better Cities Project, thank you and happy spring.